The airplane cabin buzzed with the usual hum of excitement and impatience. Passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, hoisting bags into overhead compartments, settling into their seats with weary smiles or eager chatter. Amid the chaos, Amira stood quietly, gripping her boarding pass with both hands. Her heart thudded softly beneath her navy blue hijab, neatly pinned and perfectly matched with her long, flowing dress. It was a big day, her first solo flight to visit her grandmother, who was recovering from surgery. She whispered a silent prayer, asking for safe travels, before stepping forward to find her seat. Row 14, seat BA window seat, just like she had hoped. Amira's lips curved into a small smile as she imagined gazing at the clouds, lost in her thoughts above the world. But as she approached her row, her footsteps faltered. A woman was already seated there, her designer handbag occupying the seat next to her. Blonde curls bounced around her shoulders as she tapped impatiently on her phone, her manicured fingers clicking rhythmically against the screen. "Excuse me," Amira's voice was gentle, polite. "I believe that's my seat." She showed her boarding pass, the bold print clearly displaying 14B. The woman's eyes flicked up, scanning Amira from head to toe. Her expression tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before she scoffed. "Are you sure? Maybe you read it wrong." Her tone was sharp, condescending. Amira's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She glanced down, double-checking the seat number. "Yes, it's 14B. She offered a tentative smile, trying to keep the interaction pleasant. The woman sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. "Unbelievable. They really are letting anyone on these flights now, huh?" She grabbed her bag and placed it on her lap, scooting slightly but making no effort to actually get up. Her body language screamed resistance. Amira hesitated, the joy of her first solo trip dimming under the woman's cold stare. She swallowed, her throat tightening, but she slid into her seat, keeping her movements small and unintrusive. She felt the woman's gaze linger, sharp and unkind, before the blonde finally turned back to her phone, muttering under her breath. Moments later, a flight attendant moved down the aisle, her smile bright and practiced. "Good afternoon, ladies. Is everything all right here?" Amira looked up, about to nod, but the woman cut in sharply. "Actually, no. There's an issue." She leaned closer to the flight attendant, her voice lowering but still loud enough for Amira to hear. "I don't feel comfortable sitting here. Is there any chance I can be moved?" The flight attendant blinked, her professional demeanor faltering for just a second. "Oh, I'm sorry for any inconvenience. May I ask what the issue is?" The woman huffed, her eyes flicking toward Amira before quickly looking away, her lips curling in distaste. I don't feel safe. You never know these days." Amira's heart sank. The meaning behind those words was unmistakable. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her seat, her pulse quickening. The air suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, to ask what she had done to deserve this. But the words tangled in her throat, frozen by shock and hurt. The flight attendant's eyes widened, clearly uncomfortable. She looked between Amira and the woman, her professionalism wavering. I'll check to see if there are any open seats. Please excuse me." She hurried off, her heels clicking against the aisle floor. Amira stared straight ahead, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She focused on her breathing, trying to stay calm, to not let the hot tears building behind her eyes fall. She thought about her grandmother, her warm hugs and soothing words. She thought about her parents, who had warned her that traveling alone might not always be easy. But nothing could have prepared her for this. The woman beside her crossed her arms, her body angled away from Amira, as if mere proximity was offensive. Amira could feel the stares from nearby passengers, curious eyes peeking over headrests, whispering behind hands. She sank deeper into her seat, wishing she could disappear. Minutes stretched on, each second a weight pressing down on her. Finally, the flight attendant returned, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is fully booked. There are no available seats to move you to." The woman's eyes flashed with irritation. "Are you serious? So, I'm just supposed to sit here, feeling unsafe, the entire flight?" Her voice was loud, intentionally so. Amira felt herself shrinking further, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The flight attendant's smile faltered. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but there are no other options. If you're uncomfortable, you're welcome to speak with the gate agent about possibly taking a later flight." The woman scoffed, clearly unhappy. Unbelievable. I'll be filing a complaint about this. She shot a withering glare in Amira's direction before turning away, her body rigid with indignation. Amira's chest tightened, a storm of emotions swirling within her: hurt, anger, humiliation. But above all, an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She felt invisible, insignificant, judged without reason. All because of a scarf on her head. She wanted to cry, to scream, to ask why she was being treated this way. But instead, she sat in silence, staring out the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway. Her dreams of a peaceful journey shattered before the plane even left the ground. But she had no idea that this was only the beginning. What would happen next would be more shocking than she could have ever imagined. As the plane ascended, Amira kept her eyes glued to the window, watching the ground grow smaller and smaller until the city was just a patchwork of tiny squares. She tried to focus on the view, on the clouds that looked so soft and peaceful, floating against a vast blue sky. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the heavy knot of emotion sitting in her chest. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her nails pressing into her palms. She was fighting to stay composed, to not let her tears fall. She refused to give the woman beside her the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The woman's presence was like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. Amira could feel her shifting uncomfortably, her body angled away as if she were afraid to even breathe the same air. The tension was palpable, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. Amira wanted to turn and say something, anything, to break the silence, to confront the hurtful words still echoing in her mind. But her voice felt trapped, tangled up in a mix of pain and anger. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, a welcome distraction. She pulled it out and saw a text from her mom. "Have a safe flight, sweetheart. Call us as soon as you land. Love you." A lump formed in Amira's throat. She typed back quickly, her fingers shaking slightly. "I will, Mom. Love you too." She hesitated, almost telling her what had just happened, but she didn't want to worry her parents. They were already anxious about her traveling alone. She forced a smile, sending a few heart emojis to hide the sadness she was feeling. Amira leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. She thought about her grandmother, the woman who had taught her to wear her hijab with pride, who had shown her the beauty in her faith and her identity. She remembered the stories her grandmother would tell, about her own struggles and triumphs, about standing tall no matter what people said or thought. The memory brought a wave of warmth, soothing the sting of the woman's cruel words. A faint voice crackled over the intercom, breaking her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude. The flight attendants will be coming around with refreshments shortly. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The captain's voice was calm, steady, but it did nothing to ease the tension sitting between Amira and her seatmate. The woman huffed loudly, crossing her arms tighter. "I still can't believe they couldn't move me," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough for Amira to hear. Her voice dripped with disdain, the words sharp and meant to wound. Amira's heart clenched, but she stayed silent, keeping her eyes fixed on the seat in front of her. A flight attendant approached, her smile warm as she offered drinks and snacks. Amira asked for water, her voice quiet, barely above a whisper. The woman beside her didn't even look up, just waved her hand dismissively. "No, I don't need anything." Her tone was curt, her expression cold. Amira took a small sip of her water, her throat dry. She tried to distract herself, pulling out a book from her backpack, but the words blurred together, her mind replaying the woman's hateful comments over and over again. She wondered how someone could judge her so harshly, without even knowing her. How her mere presence could make someone feel unsafe. Her thoughts wandered back to school, to the whispers and stares she sometimes got in the hallways. To the time a boy had yanked at her hijab as he ran past, laughing as he shouted something cruel. To the teacher who had looked the other way, pretending not to notice. She had learned to brush it off, to hold her head high and keep walking. But today, trapped in this seat with nowhere to go, the hurt felt deeper, more suffocating. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, hoping no one noticed. But the woman beside her glanced over, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Seriously?" she muttered, shaking her head. "This is exactly why I wanted to move. So dramatic." Amira's chest tightened, the air feeling heavier, harder to breathe. She felt small, insignificant, as if her existence was an inconvenience. She wanted to stand up, to scream, to ask why this woman hated her so much without even knowing her name. But her voice was stuck, her courage buried beneath layers of pain and humiliation. The flight dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. Amira stared out the window, trying to lose herself in the sky, in the vastness that made her problems feel small. She repeated her grandmother's words like a mantra, "You are stronger than their hate. You are more than their ignorance." But even those words struggled to break through the hurt she was feeling. A sudden jolt shook the plane, and the seatbelt sign dinged on. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Amira gripped the armrests, her heart pounding as the plane shuddered again. She wasn't a fan of turbulence, and the anxiety building in her chest was getting harder to control. She closed her eyes, whispering another prayer, trying to steady her breathing. Beside her, the woman sighed dramatically, muttering, "Great. Just what I needed." Her annoyance was clear, as if the turbulence were somehow Amira's fault, too. Amira kept her eyes closed, trying to block out the woman's negativity, focusing on the rhythmic hum of the engines. But then the plane jolted harder, a sudden drop that made her stomach flip. She heard passengers gasp, a baby crying somewhere behind her. The air was tense, heavy with fear. Amira's fingers tightened on the armrest, her knuckles turning white. Her silent prayers grew faster, more urgent. She wanted to be brave, to trust that everything would be okay, but the fear was real, and it was consuming her. The woman beside her let out a shaky breath, finally showing a crack in her cold exterior. Her hand gripped the armrest they shared, her knuckles just as white as Amira's. For a moment, their hands were inches apart, both clinging to the same piece of metal, both afraid, both human. But just as quickly, the woman pulled her hand away, as if touching the same armrest as Amira was somehow tainting. She crossed her arms again, her body rigid, her jaw tight. Amira's chest tightened, a fresh wave of pain washing over her. She realized then that no amount of fear or shared humanity could change the way this woman saw her. No prayer or kindness could soften a heart that refused to see beyond a hijab. The turbulence eased, the plane leveling out as the captain's voice assured everyone they were safe. But the tension between them remained, thicker than ever. Amira took a shaky breath, her heart still racing. She stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by, her reflection faintly visible against the glass. She saw herself, small, vulnerable, hurt, but she also saw her grandmother's face, her mother's smile, her father's pride. She remembered who she was, where she came from, and the strength they had given her. And in that moment, Amira made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let this woman's ignorance define her journey. She wouldn't let this pain steal her voice. But as the plane continued to soar through the sky, Amira had no idea that the challenges ahead would test that promise in ways she could never have imagined. The rest of the flight was painfully quiet, filled with unspoken words and heavy tension. Amira stayed glued to the window, pretending to be lost in the view, but her mind raced with everything that had happened. She tried to focus on her grandmother's smile, on the stories she would tell when she arrived, on the familiar scent of her cooking that always made Amira feel safe. But the woman's hateful words kept echoing, refusing to let her find peace. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere grew more tense. The woman beside her sat stiffly, her body angled away as much as possible. Amira wondered how someone could carry so much hatred for a stranger they knew nothing about. She wondered what made her so different in this woman's eyes. Was it her scarf? Her skin? Her quietness? The questions buzzed in her head, each one heavier than the last. The landing was smooth, the wheels touching down with a slight bump. Amira let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, grateful to be back on solid ground. But her relief was short-lived. As the plane taxied to the gate, the woman huffed loudly, unbuckling her seatbelt with an exaggerated sigh. Finally, I need to get out of here before I lose my mind. Amira's chest tightened, the words stabbing deeper than she expected. She turned away, pretending to check her phone, but her hands were shaking. She just wanted to get off this plane, away from the hateful glares and sharp words. She just wanted to breathe again. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, the woman shot up, grabbing her bag and pushing her way into the aisle before anyone else could stand. She didn't look back, didn't spare Amira another glance as she hurried off the plane. Amira watched her go, a mix of relief and lingering pain swirling inside her. But before she could process it, she heard murmurs around her. She was so rude, a voice whispered from the row behind. I felt so bad for that girl. I know, another voice agreed softly. I don't understand why people have to be like that. Amira's heart skipped. She hadn't realized people were watching, that they had noticed how she was treated. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope, of comfort. She wasn't as invisible as she thought. But that relief was fleeting, replaced by embarrassment. She hated that her pain had been on display, that strangers had witnessed her humiliation. Her face burned as she stood, gathering her things and stepping into the aisle. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact, trying to disappear into the crowd of passengers shuffling toward the exit. She felt eyes on her, curious and pitying, and it made her skin crawl. She wanted to scream that she didn't need their pity, that she was strong enough to handle this. But she stayed silent, moving quickly toward the exit, her heart pounding. Stepping off the plane, Amira took a deep breath, the cool airport air filling her lungs. But the heaviness in her chest didn't ease. She followed the flow of people through the terminal, her feet moving on autopilot. Her mind was still trapped on that plane, replaying every cruel word, every hateful glare. She found a quiet corner near the baggage claim, sinking onto a bench as she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her mom's contact staring back at her. She wanted to call, to hear her mom's comforting voice, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She didn't want to worry her parents. She didn't want them to feel the pain she was carrying. Her eyes burned, but she blinked back the tears, refusing to let them fall. She wouldn't let that woman's ignorance break her. She wouldn't give her that power. Excuse me? A soft voice broke through her thoughts. Amira looked up, surprised to see the flight attendant from earlier standing in front of her. Her expression was gentle, her eyes filled with concern. I just wanted to check on you. I noticed what happened on the plane, and I'm really sorry. That was completely unacceptable. Amira's chest tightened, her composure cracking. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words got stuck, tangled up with the emotions she was fighting to keep down. She managed a small nod, her eyes dropping to her lap. The flight attendant sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. I feel awful that you had to go through that, she continued, her voice sincere. I should have handled it better. I didn't know how to respond, but that's no excuse. You didn't deserve to be treated like that. Amira's throat tightened, her heart swelling with gratitude and pain. It was the first time someone had acknowledged her hurt, the first time someone had shown her kindness today. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't do anything wrong. I know, the flight attendant said, her eyes softening. People can be cruel for no reason. It's not about you. It's about their own ignorance and fear. She hesitated, her gaze dropping. I've seen it before. Too many times. Amira's eyes widened, surprised by the woman's honesty. She looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the sadness in her eyes, the weariness of someone who had witnessed too much. Does it always feel like this? Amira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The flight attendant sighed, her shoulders sagging. I wish I could say no. But people carry their prejudices with them wherever they go, even on airplanes. She looked at Amira, her expression fierce. But that doesn't mean you're powerless. You have every right to be here, to exist, to travel, to live your life without fear or shame. Amira's heart swelled, the tightness in her chest easing just a little. She had needed to hear those words more than she realized. For the first time since boarding that plane, she felt seen, understood. The flight attendant stood, her expression softening. If you need anything, or if you want to file a complaint, let me know. I'll back you up. Amira managed a small smile, the first real one all day. Thank you. I'll think about it. The woman nodded, her lips curving into a gentle smile. Take care of yourself, okay? And don't let anyone make you feel less than who you are. With that, she walked away, leaving Amira alone with her thoughts. Amira sat there for a long time, replaying the woman's words in her mind. She felt a spark of strength reignite within her, a flicker of hope. Maybe she couldn't change the woman on the plane. Maybe she couldn't change the world overnight. But she could control how she responded, how she carried herself. She stood, her shoulders a little straighter, her head a little higher. She wouldn't let ignorance define her. She wouldn't let hate steal her voice. As she walked toward the baggage claim, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift, just a little. But she had no idea that this was only the beginning of her journey, that the challenges she faced today were just the start of a battle she never expected to fight. Amira made her way through the bustling airport, her heart still heavy but her resolve growing stronger with each step. She kept her chin up, her shoulders squared, determined not to let the day's events break her. She wouldn't let that woman's hatred define her journey or taint her excitement about visiting her grandmother. But as she approached the baggage claim, a familiar voice sent a chill down her spine. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." Amira's heart sank as she looked up and saw the same woman standing by the conveyor belt, her arms crossed, an irritated scowl on her face. She was talking to another woman, shaking her head as if the very sight of Amira was an inconvenience. Amira felt a wave of anger wash over her, but she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let this woman get under her skin. She had just as much right to be here as anyone else. She stood a few feet away, her eyes focused on the conveyor belt, waiting for her suitcase to appear. But the woman's voice grew louder, her words cutting through the noise of the busy airport. "It's ridiculous. I can't believe they let people like her fly. It's a security risk, plain and simple." Her friend's eyes widened, her gaze flicking nervously toward Amira before she quickly looked away, pretending not to hear. Amira's chest tightened, her hands clenching at her sides. She wanted to turn around and confront the woman, to demand to know how she could be so hateful, so ignorant. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, her voice trapped in her throat. She hated that this woman had this power over her, that her words could still hurt so much. The conveyor belt rumbled to life, suitcases spilling out one by one. Amira's eyes scanned the line of bags, her heart pounding as she willed her suitcase to appear quickly so she could get away from this awful scene. But the woman kept talking, her voice sharp and mocking. "I mean, look at her. It's like she's hiding something under that thing." Amira's vision blurred with tears, her face burning with humiliation. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and escape the hateful glares, the cruel words. But just as she was about to turn and walk away, she heard another voice, a strong, clear voice that cut through the noise like a blade. "That's enough." Amira's head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat. A man was standing a few feet away, his expression firm, his eyes blazing with anger. He was tall, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, his stance confident and unwavering. He was looking directly at the woman, his jaw clenched. "You've been spewing your ignorance since the plane. It's disgusting. Leave her alone." The woman's eyes widened, her mouth falling open in shock. "Excuse me?" she sputtered, her voice high and outraged. "I have every right to express my opinion." "Your opinion is rooted in hate and ignorance," the man shot back, his voice steady. "And your words are harassment. You're embarrassing yourself. Just stop." Amira's heart pounded, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She couldn't believe someone was standing up for her, a stranger who didn't even know her name. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how much his words meant, but she was frozen, her voice lost in the storm of emotions swirling inside her. The woman's face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find a response. But she seemed to realize she was outmatched. Her gaze flicked around, noticing the people staring, the judgmental looks being thrown her way. Her shoulders stiffened, and she let out an angry huff, turning on her heel and stomping away without another word. Her friend hurried after her, glancing nervously at Amira before disappearing into the crowd. The man turned to Amira, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his eyes kind and concerned. Amira opened her mouth, but her voice cracked, the words sticking in her throat. She managed a nod, her eyes stinging as she blinked back tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. I didn't know what to say." "You shouldn't have to say anything," the man replied, his voice firm. "People like that don't deserve your energy." He hesitated, his gaze dropping for a moment. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. No one should be treated that way." Amira's chest tightened, the pain and anger she'd been holding back all day rising to the surface. She felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it, and she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. "I don't get it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't do anything to her. Why does she hate me so much?" The man's expression softened, his eyes filled with sympathy. "Some people hate what they don't understand," he said quietly. "They see something different, and it scares them. But that's their problem, not yours. Amira took a shaky breath, his words sinking in. She wanted to believe him, but the pain was still raw, the wounds still fresh. She looked away, her gaze dropping to the floor as she tried to steady herself. I thought things were getting better. That people were more accepting now. They are, the man said softly. But there will always be people who refuse to change. You can't control their ignorance, but you can control how you respond. He offered her a small, gentle smile. And you responded with more grace than most people would. That shows your strength, not their power. Amira felt her chest loosen, the weight on her shoulders easing just a little. She looked up at him, truly seeing him for the first time. His kindness, his courage, his willingness to speak up when no one else did. It meant more to her than she could put into words. Thank you, she whispered again, her voice steadier this time. You didn't have to help me, but I'm glad you did. The man shrugged, his smile widening. Sometimes doing the right thing is the only choice that makes sense. He hesitated, then added, I hope you don't let her ruin the rest of your day. You deserve better than that. Amira nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. I'll try, she promised, her voice stronger now. I'll try to remember that. The man gave her a warm nod before turning to leave, his figure blending into the crowd. Amira watched him go, her heart lighter than it had been all day. She felt a flicker of hope, a spark of courage reigniting inside her. But as she turned back to the conveyor belt, her suitcase finally appearing among the other bags, she couldn't shake the feeling that this journey wasn't over. That there were still challenges ahead, still battles to fight. She took a deep breath, her shoulders squaring as she reached for her bag. She didn't know what awaited her outside these airport walls, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't be silent anymore. She wouldn't let fear or hatred define her story. And she wouldn't let anyone take away her right to exist, to be seen, to be heard. No matter what happened next, Amira gripped the handle of her suitcase, her heart steadying as she walked toward the exit. She repeated the man's words in her head like a mantra. You can't control their ignorance, but you can control how you respond. It gave her strength, a sense of power she hadn't felt all day. She was determined to carry herself with dignity, to rise above the hate that tried to pull her down. But as she stepped out into the bustling terminal, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a message from her grandmother, but her chest tightened when she saw the notification. You've been tagged in a video, asterisk. Her fingers trembled as she clicked on it, her heart sinking when the video started playing. Her face filled the screen, her eyes wide and hurt, her posture tense as she sat frozen in her airplane seat. The woman's voice could be heard clearly, her cruel words echoing through the speakers. I don't feel safe sitting next to asterisk her. Who knows what she's hiding under that thing? Amira's stomach turned as she realized someone had been recording the entire incident. The video showed her looking small and vulnerable, her silence misinterpreted as guilt. Her cheeks burned as she read the comments flooding in below the post. This is why I don't fly anymore. Security is too lenient. She's probably planning something. Good on that lady for speaking up. People like her shouldn't be allowed to fly. It's too dangerous. Amira's vision blurred as she scrolled through the hateful messages, each one cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't just the woman on the plane anymore. Now thousands of strangers were judging her, condemning her, calling her a threat without even knowing who she was. Her hands shook as she turned off her phone, her body numb with shock. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her story had been twisted, her pain turned into entertainment for people who didn't care about the truth. She felt exposed, violated, her dignity stripped away by strangers who didn't even see her as human. She looked around the terminal, suddenly feeling like everyone was staring at her, judging her. Her skin crawled, her chest tightening as panic threatened to consume her. She couldn't escape this. It was on the internet now, spreading like wildfire, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her eyes stung as she fought back tears, refusing to break down in front of all these people. She couldn't let them see her cry, couldn't give them that satisfaction. But she didn't know how to fight this, how to defend herself against an enemy she couldn't even see. Her phone buzzed again, and she forced herself to look, her heart dropping when she saw the messages from her friends. Amira, are you okay? I just saw the video. Call me. This is so messed up. People are saying horrible things. I'm here if you need to talk. Don't read the comments. Please don't let them get to you. Amira's throat tightened, the reality crashing down on her. Her friends knew. Her family would find out soon. Her whole community would see this video, hear those hateful words, and she would be humiliated all over again. Her heart ached, the pain sharp and unrelenting. She wanted to scream, to shout that she wasn't who they thought she was, that she was just a girl who wanted to visit her grandmother, just a human being who deserved respect. But her voice felt trapped, buried under the weight of their judgments, their ignorance. She looked around the airport, her eyes darting from face to face, terrified that someone would recognize her. What if they believed the lies? What if they saw her as a threat, as something to fear? She felt herself shrinking, her confidence crumbling under the pressure. But then, a hand rested gently on her shoulder. Amira flinched, turning to see the man from the baggage claim standing beside her, his eyes filled with concern. "I saw the video," he said softly, his voice laced with anger and sympathy. "It's everywhere." Amira's heart sank, her worst fears confirmed. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just sat there. I didn't deserve this." "I know," he said, his voice firm. "That woman was in the wrong. And now she's twisting the story to justify her hate. It's not fair, but that's what people like her do. They create their own narrative to feel powerful." Amira looked away, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "They're calling me a terrorist. They're saying I'm dangerous just because of how I look. I can't fight that." "You shouldn't have to fight alone," he replied, his jaw clenching. "You don't deserve this. No one does." He hesitated, his expression softening. "If you want, I can help you. We can set the record straight, tell your side of the story. But only if you're ready." Amira's heart pounded, her mind racing. She was terrified, vulnerable, and exhausted. But she was also angry. Angry that her identity had been weaponized against her. Angry that people who knew nothing about her had the power to define her story. She took a shaky breath, her shoulders straightening as she looked up at him. "I don't want to hide," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't want to be afraid of who I am." The man's eyes softened, a proud smile curving his lips. "Then let's show them the truth. Let's show them your courage." Amira's chest tightened, fear and hope swirling inside her. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if the world was ready to hear her story. But she was tired of being silent, tired of letting hate drown out her voice. She looked down at her phone, her reflection staring back at her, eyes wide and vulnerable but filled with a newfound strength. She didn't want to be seen as a victim. She wanted to be seen as herself, proud, resilient, and unapologetically human. Taking a deep breath, she met the man's gaze and nodded. "Okay," she whispered, her voice steady. "Let's do this." But as they walked toward the airport exit, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She turned, her heart skipping as she saw the woman from the plane, her face twisted in anger as she pointed her phone directly at Amira, her mouth moving rapidly as she recorded another video. Amira's blood ran cold, her heart pounding. The woman wasn't done. She was still spreading her lies, still trying to paint Amira as the villain. And this time, she was ready to escalate things even further. Amira's heart raced as she watched the woman's phone pointed directly at her, the lens capturing her every move. It felt like déjà vu, the same sinking feeling she had on the plane when the world around her turned hostile. But this time, she wasn't frozen. This time, she felt anger rising, a fierce need to stand her ground and fight back. She could see the woman's lips moving rapidly, her expression animated as she narrated her version of the story. Amira couldn't hear the words, but she could imagine them. More lies, more fear-mongering, more hate. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate her. But then she remembered the man's words. "You can't control their ignorance, but you can control how you respond." Amira took a deep breath, her shoulders squaring as she looked at the man standing beside her. His eyes were locked on the woman, his jaw clenched in anger. "She's not giving up, is she?" he murmured, his voice low. Amira shook her head, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. "No, she won't stop until she gets what she wants." Her fingers tightened around her phone, her heart pounding. But she's not going to win. Before she could second-guess herself, Amira turned on her phone's camera and hit record, pointing it directly at the woman. Her voice came out strong and clear, surprising even herself. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone unwavering. "Why are you recording me?" The woman's head snapped up, her eyes widening as she realized Amira was filming her. For a split second, she looked caught off guard, her mouth falling open in shock. But she quickly recovered, her face twisting into a sneer. "I'm recording you because people need to see the truth," she shot back, her voice loud and indignant. "They need to know who you really are." Amira's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. "And who do you think I am?" she asked, her voice steady. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. All you see is this." She gestured to her hijab, her chin held high. "And you think that makes me dangerous?" The woman's face flushed, her eyes flicking nervously to the people who were starting to gather, their curious eyes watching the confrontation. She faltered, her voice losing some of its bite. I'm just looking out for my safety. For everyone's safety. People like you, you're hiding something." Amira felt a wave of anger, her chest tightening. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice cold. "You mean people who look different from you? People who practice a different faith?" She took a step forward, her gaze locked on the woman. "I've done nothing to you. I've done nothing to anyone. But you decided to turn me into a villain because you don't understand me. Because you refuse to see me as human." The woman's eyes widened, her face paling as she took a step back. Her phone wavered, the camera shaking as her confidence crumbled. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Amira felt her courage growing, the power of her voice breaking through the fear that had silenced her for so long. "You've been spreading lies about me," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You recorded me without my consent. You accused me of being a threat without any proof, just because of how I look. Do you even realize how dangerous that is? Do you understand what your hatred could do to someone's life?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, faces hardening as they realized the gravity of the situation. People began recording on their own phones, capturing the confrontation from all angles. The woman's face turned red, her eyes darting around as she realized the narrative was slipping out of her control. She opened her mouth, her voice shaking. I was just being cautious. You can't blame me for being cautious." "Cautious?" Amira's voice trembled with anger. "You humiliated me. You accused me of being dangerous without any reason. That's not caution, that's bigotry." She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. "You don't get to hide behind caution to justify your hate." The woman's face crumbled, her bravado falling away as she looked around at the crowd, realizing she was no longer the hero of this story. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes dropping to the floor as she mumbled, I didn't mean for it to go this far." Amira's chest tightened, her anger softening just a little as she saw the fear and shame in the woman's eyes. But she didn't let her voice waver. "It went this far because of your actions. You made me feel unsafe. You tried to turn the world against me, just because of my faith, my identity. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" The woman looked up, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked lost, overwhelmed, and defeated. She swallowed hard, her shoulders slumping as she whispered, I'm sorry." Amira felt the breath leave her lungs, her heart thudding in her chest. She hadn't expected an apology. She hadn't expected the woman to back down at all. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. But then she remembered the pain, the humiliation, the fear. She remembered the hateful comments, the lies, the way her identity had been weaponized against her. Her voice was firm, unwavering. "Sorry isn't enough," she said quietly. "You need to do better. You need to unlearn your hate. Because if you don't, you'll keep hurting people. And no one deserves that." The woman's face crumpled, her shoulders shaking as she looked down, defeated. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The tension hung in the air, heavy and electric. But Amira felt a weight lift off her chest, her heart beating steadily as she watched the woman go. She turned off her phone, the recording saved, her truth documented. The man beside her let out a breath, his eyes filled with admiration. "You were incredible," he whispered. "You stood up for yourself. You changed the narrative." Amira looked at him, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "I just told the truth," she said quietly. "I just showed them who I really am." The man nodded, his gaze steady. And that made all the difference. Amira felt a tear slip down her cheek, a tear of relief, of victory. She had faced her fear, confronted the hate, and reclaimed her story. She was no longer a victim. She was a fighter. As they walked toward the exit, Amira felt the sunlight on her face, warm and freeing. She didn't know what challenges awaited her, what battles she would have to fight next. But she knew she wouldn't be silent anymore. She wouldn't let hate define her. And no matter what happened, she would keep moving forward, proud and unapologetic, her voice unbroken. As Amira stepped out of the airport, the sunlight felt different on her skin, warmer, lighter, as if the weight she had been carrying all day was finally lifting. She took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill her lungs, grounding her in the present. For the first time since the flight, she felt free. The man walked beside her, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes reflecting a quiet pride. "You did more than just stand up for yourself," he said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "You stood up for so many people who've been silenced, who've been judged unfairly just for being who they are." Amira looked at him, gratitude swelling in her chest. "I was terrified," she admitted, her voice trembling with lingering emotion. "But I couldn't let her control my story. Not anymore." He nodded, his gaze warm. "You turned her hate into a moment of courage. Not everyone can do that." Amira felt her heart swell, her spirit steadying as she realized the power of her own voice. She looked around the bustling airport parking lot, people hurrying by, unaware of the storm she had just weathered. But she was still here, still standing, still herself. And that was a victory in itself. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, she didn't feel the familiar dread. She pulled it out, her eyes widening when she saw the notifications. Dozens of messages poured in from friends, acquaintances, even strangers who had seen the confrontation. But the words were different now, messages of support, solidarity, and admiration. "I'm so proud of you, Amira. You were brave. You spoke for all of us. Thank you for standing up. You're stronger than hate. Keep being you." Her eyes stung, her heart aching with gratitude as she realized she wasn't alone. Her truth had resonated, her courage inspiring others to speak out against the prejudice they faced. She had feared judgment, but instead, she had found community. Amira looked at the man, her voice breaking as she said, "I thought speaking up would make things worse. But it gave me my voice back." He smiled, his eyes shining. "That's the power of truth. It breaks through the lies, no matter how loud they are." Amira's phone buzzed again, and her breath caught when she saw the notification. It was a video, one recorded by someone in the crowd, showing the moment she confronted the woman. The caption read, "Courage over hate. Young woman stands up against Islamophobia." The video was already gaining traction, people commenting words of support, sharing their own experiences with discrimination. The narrative was shifting, the truth spreading. Amira's heart raced as she watched herself on screen, her voice clear and unwavering, her pain transformed into strength. The man's voice broke through her thoughts. "You changed the story. You didn't let her define you." Amira looked at him, her eyes bright. "I was afraid of the world seeing me. But now, I'm proud of who I am. Of where I come from." She touched her hijab, her fingers steady, her heart full. "This is me, and I won't hide that anymore." His smile widened, his face filled with respect. "Keep showing the world who you are. That's how we fight ignorance. That's how we win." They walked together toward the parking lot, the tension of the day slowly melting away. Amira felt lighter, her steps sure and steady. She glanced back at the airport, the place that had threatened to shatter her, but had ultimately made her stronger. As they reached the curb, the man paused, his expression turning serious. "What are you going to do next?" Amira looked down at her phone, the video still playing, her voice echoing through the speakers. She felt a sense of purpose, a fire igniting within her. "I'm going to share my story. Not just this one, but all the stories people are too afraid to tell. The ones that deserve to be heard." The man's eyes sparkled with admiration. "Then keep speaking. Keep fighting. The world needs your voice." Amira felt a lump rise in her throat, overwhelmed by his support, by the courage she had found in herself. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "For believing in me. For helping me find my voice." He shook his head, his smile soft. "You always had it. You just needed to be reminded of your power." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling into her heart. She realized then that her story didn't end here. It was just beginning. As the man walked away, Amira watched him go, a sense of hope blooming inside her. She looked down at her phone one last time, her reflection staring back at her, eyes bright with determination. She opened her social media app, her fingers steady as she typed a caption. "I won't be silenced. My voice matters. Our stories matter." She hit post, her heart racing as she took that final step, reclaiming her narrative. She had been humiliated, judged, and dehumanized, but she had risen above it all. She had turned pain into power, hate into hope. As she walked toward the parking lot, the sun setting behind her, Amira felt a sense of peace, her spirit unbroken. She was more than their stereotypes, more than their fear. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a friend. She was strong, resilient, unapologetically herself. And no matter what challenges awaited her, she would keep walking forward, head held high, her voice echoing in the world that had tried to silence her. Amira knew she couldn't change everyone's mind. But she could speak her truth. She could show the world who she was. And that was enough. With a deep breath, she opened her phone once more, ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't just telling her story. She was living it, boldly, fearlessly, beautifully. And nothing could take that away from her.